All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Lincoln Michel, and I'd like to thank you all for gathering around this blasted altar on this dark and foreboding day, while all around us are the cries of the undead searching for eldritch tomes for their infernal spells. Anyway, we're going to discuss horror fiction. Thank you for coming out. The more official opening statement that I should say here is that I would like you to know that the books by the authors in this program can be purchased by Greenlight Bookstore over to the right, point right. The authors will also be signing books immediately following the program at the signing table next to the stage. And yes, I'm going to have our readers, our panelists each read from their books for a couple minutes, then I'm going to ask some questions, and then we'll save some time at the end for audience Q&As. If you have a question, walk up to this microphone when we get to that point of the program. And I was also supposed to tell you all that this is being recorded, so ask a question that you want posterity to know about. So let me introduce our panelists. We have Victor LaValle, who's the author of 8 works of fiction and 2 comic books. His novel, The Changeling, has been adapted for television and is now airing on Apple TV. He teaches at Columbia University. And then And next to Victor is Allegra Hyde, who is the author of the story collection The Last Catastrophe, which was an editor's choice selection at the New York Times. Her debut novel, Eleutheria, was named a Best Book of 2022 by The New Yorker, and her first story collection, Of This New World, won the John Simmons Short Fiction Award. Hyde teaches creative writing at Oberlin College. And last, we have Gabino Iglesias, is a writer, professor, editor, and literary critic. He is the Bram Stoker and Shirley Jackson Award-winning author of The Devil Takes You Home, Coyote Songs, and Zero Saints. He writes about books for places like NPR and the Boston Globe, and teaches creative writing at SNHU's online MFA and the University of California, Riverside Low Residency MFA. And then, we're going to have each is going to read from their most recent book for a couple minutes. And Victor, you want to start?
Sure. Okay. Hello, everybody. It's really nice to be here. So I'm just going to read a page or two from the opening of the book, if I can get to it. All right. There are 2 kinds of people in this world, those who live with shame and those who die from it. On Tuesday, Adelaide Henry would have called herself the former, but by Wednesday, she wasn't as sure. If she was trying to live, then why would she be walking through her family's farmhouse, carrying an Atlas jar of gasoline, pouring that gasoline on the kitchen floor, the dining table, dousing the settee in the den? And after she emptied the first Atlas jar, why go back to the kitchen for the other jar, then climb the stairs to the 2nd floor, listening to the splash of gasoline on every step? What was she planning, to live or trying to die? There were 27 black farming families in California's Lucerne Valley in 1915. Adelaide and her parents had been one of them. After today, there would be only 26. Adelaide reached the 2nd floor landing. She hardly smelled the gasoline anymore. Her hands were covered in fresh wounds, but she felt no pain. There were 2 bedrooms on the 2nd floor, her bedroom and her parents'. Adelaide's parents were lured west by the promise of land in this valley. The federal government encouraged Americans to homestead California. The native population had been decimated, cleared off the property. Now it was time to give it all away. This invitation was one of the few that the United States extended to even its Negro citizens. And after 1866, the California Society put out a call to colonize Southern California. The Henrys were among the hundreds who came. They weren't going to get a fair shot in Arkansas, that was for damn sure. The federal government called this homesteading. Glenville and Eleanor Henry fled to California and grew alfalfa and wild grass, sold it to cattle owners for feed. Glenville studied the work of Luther Burbank, and in 1908, they began growing the botanist's Santa Rosa plums. To Adelaide, the fruit tasted of sugar and self-determination. Adelaide had worked the orchards and fields alongside her daddy since she was 12, labored in the kitchen and the barn with her mother for even longer. 31 years of life on this farm. 31. And now she would burn it all down. Thanks.
All right, the horrors of public speaking happening right now. I'm going to read from a short story called Endangered. The artists were kept in cages. This was for their own good. The world had gotten really ugly really fast, and the artists generally did not have the skills to survive. Most did not know how to shoot guns, for instance, or how to make bombs out of soda bottles. The artists were a dying breed, in all honesty, which is why the government, along with a few wealthy do-gooders, put them in cages, nice cages, that resembled the artists' natural habitats. One pen looked like a gallery opening with wine, cheese, and water crackers restocked daily. Another featured dumpster couches paired with a threadbare oriental rug. Nude models were occasionally sent into the enclosures, which sometimes interested the artists, sometimes not. These habitats were all very thoughtful, top of the line, really, and tailored to the artist's individual needs. In fact, one could argue that the environments were identical replications of how the artists lived in the wild, other than the glass walls installed for spectating. Criticism of the artist preservation program was scant. When criticism did come, it came from little girls mostly, who visited the zoo as the daughters of government officials and high-level bureaucrats and pop stars, who said the artist looked unhappy. He looks unhappy, the little girls told their parents. Why isn't he painting? And why isn't she sculpting? And why are the ones over there lying motionless and staring vacantly into space? It's true, not all the artists took to art making in captivity. Some, in fact, became quite ill. Of course, every effort was made to care for them. The artists were offered a spectrum of drugs, both medicinal and psychedelic. They were even issued awards, their names inked in bold letters across certificates and inscribed into gold-plated plaques. Still, there were admittedly some incidents involving paint fumes, belt buckles strapped to ceiling beams, but these incidents were considered normal artist behavior. In the wild, after all, artists had often exhibited the effects of melancholia. Thank you.
I'm supposed to sell you The Devil Takes You Home, but I just realized if I don't get some fellow Puerto Ricans in my reading in Brooklyn, I'm never going to get them anywhere else. So the next novel takes place back home before, during, and after a hurricane, so this goes out to you. The ocean roared, rivers overflowed. The raging, mud-colored waters of rivers became a violent monster that tore through homes, demolished bridges, and left entire families scared and isolated or dead. Power lines went down everywhere. Their electric cargo suddenly let loose on the world. The greed, old and weak, had been on its last leg for decades, and Maria left every corner of the island in the dark. People flocked to shelters, churches, government buildings, and city arenas. They all filled with desperate souls. Then the shelters ran out of cots. They gave people bottled water and little else. People were scared, angry, anxious. Tempers flared. Fights broke out. Everyone felt useless and at the mercy of something violent and hateful that they couldn't control. The ghosts of those killed under the weight of the wood, brick, cement, and plaster clung to whatever was left. They were all angry and desolate. If anyone rebuilt where they died, there'd be hauntings. The wind yanked out air conditioning units that had hung underneath windows like rusty fruit for years. Wind and water entered the gaping holes left behind and destroyed sacred mementos, ruined walls, and soaked the floors. Trees broke or were ripped from the ground with their roots still wrapped in dirt. Palm trees bent until they could bend no more, and they snapped. Their coconuts became projectiles that crashed against homes and shattered windshields and windows. Plants were obliterated, crops devastated. Papaya and banana trees were the softest, so they were the first to go. The wind hollered across the decimated fields, the sound drowning the wails of the farmers who had, once again, lost everything. In a small house near a beach in Loíza, a black woman gave birth to a premature girl with a 3-inch horn protruding from the right side of her forehead. She suffocated it against her sweaty chest as the father cried in a corner, and prayed to a God that had always ignored him. The wind carried the sounds of the mother's screams over the mangled animal carcasses that littered the shore.
All right. Since this is a panel on the genre of horror fiction, I thought I'd start with asking each of you a question about genre, because something interesting about the three books we're discussing today is that they're each kind of a combination of horror and another genre. The Devil Takes You Home is maybe a horror crime novel, horror noir. The Last Catastrophe, the stories kind of combine horror with climate fiction, speculative fiction, and fabulous fiction. And Lone Women could be called maybe a Western horror. And so I'm just curious, your approach to genre, how you think about it when you're writing, and maybe I'll ask Gabino to start.
Here's an easy one. I don't. I do whatever I want, and then I realize, wow, I have to sell this, and I have to help the marketing folks place it somewhere. So I think genre is for reviewers and awesome people like librarians and booksellers. So you do the thing, and then you sit down and you crack your heads against the wall again. What is this? And then you come up with something. In my case, I couldn't come up with a eloquent working definition, so I went with barrio noir and stuck with it for the last 10 years, so it worked for me.
When I'm thinking about genre, I'm thinking of it as a tool for sharing my opinions oftentimes, because so many genres have incredible narrative engines that are already built in. If it's science fiction, we've got the engine of what if. If it's horror, to me, we're asking, how do we escape? How do we survive? And by combining those narrative engines with my opinions about climate change, patriarchy, societal collapse, I'm hopefully able to make some fiction that is readable.
I would agree with all that, but I would add, I think the great thing about, if you can even name a genre, is that it has rules in theory and conventions. And the joy is that you can break those conventions and that people might enjoy that very much, right? So in my case, I knew I was writing about the West, and I knew that broadly speaking, when you say it's a Western, I think many people, maybe not everybody, but many people think it's a white dude on a horse fighting against whoever's there, right? And so immediately I was like, no, it's about a black lady, and for a long while she doesn't have a gun, she just has a trunk with something weird inside. And already it's like, oh, all right, well, that's a different kind of thing, And then horror, I would say, like horror and comedy, I think, are actually like almost super genres because they can fit into every genre, right? So when something's called horror, I always have to ask, and what? Because alone, horror doesn't actually mean anything, except perhaps that you will feel fear, pain, terror. Like it'll be a feeling, but it won't tell you what is going to go on, And so in that way, I think you always have to combine horror with something to make it vivid,
And I feel like I'm pretty comfortable in guessing that all three of you are not in the camp that thinks fiction should be apolitical and just tell a story. All of your books deal with different social and political issues, from racism to sexism to climate change. And I guess the question here is, how do you think horror specifically, and maybe fiction generally, can be used for social critique? And maybe I'll ask Victor to go.
Well, actually, I think the thing that's interesting, at least for me as a lifelong horror fan, is how conservative horror actually is a lot of the time, right? And conservative in the lowercase c, meaning like the point of horror is often, here's normal life, here's something that disrupts normal life, can we please get back to normal life, right? And that's great if normal life was good for you to begin with. But the joy, I feel like, in newer writers and certainly older writers as well who tackled horror was to say, like, maybe, like, to my mind, the best horror, the ones I love the most, are the ones that say maybe that original life was not so great either, and that it's sort of like, here was original life, horror disrupts original life, and then the best case scenario is here's a third choice, and the third choice is one that resolves the problems of both, but I do think, that's the reason so much horror works, of like, here's a lovely suburban home, and then there's something terrible happens, and I didn't grow up in the suburbs, but I'm always like, I don't think the suburbs was this nice, you know, ever. So why are we building into that lie? So, so to my mind, there's always something to dismantle. You guys?
So I write a lot about climate change, and I find that the reality of climate change is oftentimes too horrible to even think about. The realities of mass mortality events and rising seas and intense rainstorms that come out of nowhere. It's too much to even think about and process, which is why people look away, they deny, they push climate change to the future. And so in many ways, when I'm grappling with that horror, I'm finding ways to access it diagonally, or by using humor, or by using surrealism and other techniques. So it's a matter of kind of maybe embedding stealth horror into the stories, so that I can talk about what oftentimes feels unspeakable.
Well, first it's therapy. And publishing will never pay you enough. Like, it won't never pay me enough to afford punching Ted Cruz. Like, that's not, I'm never going to make enough money to get lawyers.
We could
for
try
that.
a GoFundMe with these good people
right.
here.
Please go to. But fiction gives me the freedom to do that in a certain way on the page. So I want to talk about multiculturalism and racism, and how for many years, the fear of the other, we were the other. It was women and people of color, and now we can turn the thing around and show some other stuff. I write about monsters, but usually what people comment on are not the monsters. Like, on our way down here, Allegra was telling me the horror of the book was the medical system. So I had things to say about our healthcare system, and people don't care about the monsters or the mutilation. It's about the real horror. And it's therapeutic, and it's free, and it allows me to punch Ted Cruz in the face without leaving home.
Another thing that unites, I think, all three of your books maybe is that they're all about grief in different ways. Whether it's grief about family, about issues in the medical system, or about climate change and our planet. Do you think that grief and horror go hand in hand? Maybe I'll ask Allegra.
Maybe. I know that in this book, I'm definitely grappling with the grief of feeling like this problem of climate change and kind of other huge systemic challenges is bigger than one person can solve, or potentially even a pretty good large group of people. And so the stories are wrestling with how do we still find our way forward? How do we still find moments of compassion, joy, alongside a huge sense of dread and doom?
To that end, I also wonder, certainly I think grief is in the book, but this was one of the first books, like I was finishing it up during the pandemic, and I felt really sure that I did not want it to end as a complete downer. Because I really felt like it's just, everything's bad already. And then the main cast is, the main cast of the book are 4 women on the planes. And I talked over with my wife, and like, again, going back to the tropes of horror, 1, 2, 3 of them should probably die. Like, which ones should die? I was talking it over with her, kind of thing. And my wife was like, you can't let any of them die. It's just not, you can't do it. And I said, what are you talking about? And she was like, this was 2018, 2019. She was like, women are losing fucking everywhere. I do not want to see women losing your book. And I was like, all right. Can we kill other people? She's like, kill everybody else. Just not them. And I followed her rule. Yes.
I'm actually on the wrong panel because I don't consider myself a horror writer. I'm a failed romance writer. Every time I sit down, I want to write a romance novel because it delivers that happy ending, and I know that people want that. It feels good and makes you want to read more. and then somewhere along the line, it just crashes, and everybody dies. So it's not that grief is there. It's just I try to write to imagine happy endings for everyone, and I can't. I fall short. So then reality comes in, and then everybody suffers, and there's a lot of death and crying and violence. And then I try really hard to make it fiction, because sometimes it feels like nonfiction. But I don't try to go for the grief. It just it shows up. And I also finished it during the middle of the pandemic. I lost my job in March of 2020, and with it went my health coverage. So I was, wow, this is great. What do I do now? And then the result is that book. It was like, I'm scared, I'm angry, what do I do? I'm gonna try to write a romance about 3 guys who set out to do the right thing, and I didn't pull it off.
Well, my next question may have already been somewhat answered by your guys' last answers, but an obvious question for a horror panel is that we are in a moment in which horror feels like we're in like a horror renaissance to a degree. I was talking to someone from Barnes & Noble the other day who says that like horror is flying off the shelves in the store. Some of our most acclaimed directors are like Jordan Peele and Robert Eggers. And on TV, nonstop prestige, amazing horror shows from Black Mirror to The Last of Us to Victor LaValle's The Changeling. It's really quite good. Check it out. Apple TV. I guess the question is just what do you think it is about America in 2023 that is making people want to gravitate towards horror? If it's not too obvious.
I was gonna say, the laugh of the crowd, I feel like the answer is just sitting there in front of everybody. But I do think it's also, because I loved horror since I was younger, I do also remember the sort of fallow period of watching the folks whose books I loved in the 90s, let's say, into the early 2000s, who couldn't get their books read, couldn't get them published. Whether it's big press or small press, there weren't that many small presses putting out stuff. So I think it's also that like a general public has to be ready to sort of turn in that direction, because people are writing horror all the time, right? The question is just, when does the people writing the horror match up with the people being in a space where they want to confront some level of that horror, whether because it feels good to have it corroborated, right? Like if everybody feels under threat, sometimes it feels kind of nice to say, yes, there are threats out there. And then sometimes there's books where there's, if not solutions, at least to say like, don't give up hope. And maybe that feels nice too, But I do feel like it's just a cloud exists, and we're just walking through it.
Want me to go?
Right. Okay. I was just gonna say that I think the looming specter of the pandemic really maybe has created helped open the floodgates to an extra interest in horror, because we've all experienced that sense of our whole reality tilting sideways, and the world we know just going completely out of whack, and things that seem safe and good are suddenly are not. They're dangerous, they're deadly, and I think we're all still wrestling with that, and reading horror in any form is a way to cope.
Horror is kind of like you have chaos, but it's controlled chaos. Like you can pick where you stop reading. And to piggyback of what Victor was saying, I think horror never cared. Horror is not literature. Horror is not, it's not good fiction. It's the little brother, and it belongs in the kiddie table. And I think horror never cared. And so we built our own table with the bones of our enemies. And when the world was ready to look our way, we went, oh, now you're looking. We got a Victor. We got a Stephen Graham Jones. We have an Alma Katsu. We have a Silvia Moreno Garcia. We have a Stephen Graham Jones. We have a Brian Evanson. Now you look. Come here. We got the stuff. We got swag. We don't care what you think. And we have all these folks that produce amazing stuff. And he just clicked. And here we are, and we're not going anywhere because we have our own table.
Nice. Yeah. So I think I'm guessing that not most, but a lot of the audience is probably writers themselves. So I thought I would ask some kind of writing-related questions. I mean, these are all writing questions, but about each of your books individually. But if other panelists have thoughts on these specific questions, jump in. So Victor, Lone Woman is a historical novel in some sense, and I would just love to hear how you approached research in the book, and also how you evoked a historical period while still sounding modern, in the writing style.
Right. So I came across a book called Lone Women, A Field of One's Own, Lone Women Homesteaders in Montana, when I did a school visit at the University of Montana. And it was, I picked it off the shelf because I was interested in some local history before I left. And I didn't know anything about these single women, which they called lone women, going out there and doing this thing. And I polled a bunch of the people who I'd met from Montana, born and raised, and people who'd come to teach there, and they had never heard of these lone women either. And that was sort of, for me, the turning point between I'm interested in this subject, and also maybe there's a story to tell about this subject, right? Like, because if everybody there had known it, I would just say, well, I'm just some kid from New York, and now I learned a thing, thanks, and I'll move to the next book. So that was when I dove into it. But the thing that I wanted to avoid, particularly because I'm not from the West in any way, was, that fake West voice, whatever it might be. Hey, partner, the worst of the worst version of that, right? And even like the Deadwood version, which is this elevated, obviously no one spoke like that, but it's fun kind of Western thing. I said I want to avoid all that, so I just said I want to make it sound like it's now, like people are talking now, but the story is about then, and I hoped in a way that would help it feel more contemporary, right? Because the questions of the book about like who gets to determine their own who gets to determine the trajectory of their own life is hardly a question that has been determined for everyone on a pretty yearly, daily, hourly basis. There's somebody trying to refuse freedoms for a great number of human beings. And so it felt like, okay, if I make it feel contemporary, then maybe in that way it doesn't feel musty and dusty. So,
any thoughts on research?
Absolutely loved it because it sounds like he's not trying to do anything. So it is horror. Even Victor's work, you're always going to find some kind of social commentary that hits you at the end because he's not like banging you over the head with it. It's like, well, women, black women at this point in time, how were they talking? And you go in expecting, someone's going to botch this, not this guy. So he delivers the good, and I think that's why it's a fantastic novel that everybody should read.
And then Allegra, I'm always interested in how short story writers organize their collections. And yours is broken into sections, but also kind of thematically organized around these questions related to climate change. So just curious how, did you write all the stories for the collection? How did you organize it?
Maybe going back to research for a second,
please, yeah.
I would say, and this ties it, I promise, that I started maybe around 2015 really reading about this concept of global weirding, which is another way of thinking about global warming that places less of an emphasis on temperature rise and more on how climate change throws so many aspects of our world kind of out of whack. So, an example would be animals migrating to the wrong place, or there being a sriracha shortage right now. It's all kind of part of this global weirdness that's a result of climate change. And that was the fuel for the first few stories in the collection. And then I put that material aside for a little while until essentially the pandemic, where I wrote another kind of huge group of stories that continued expanding on that theme. And the organization was really built around how the stories relate to our familiar reality. So as you will see if you look at the table of contents and read the work, we get further and further and further from our known world. And by the end of the collection, we're in a survivalist compound with vegan zombies roaming around.
Well, I think we can all relate to the global weirding here in New York after having just swam through the streets over the weekend. Gabino, I saw you tweet or post or whatever we're calling it now that you had people when you were writing this novel who advised you, not to put in so much violence, not to put in so much Spanish, and then you said, "quote I did what I wanted," and you wrote an award-winning, amazing novel, and I thought maybe you could talk about, how do you say "fuck it, I'm doing my thing" when writing. And I would love to hear Victor and Allegra talking about
I think you just did. It's like, don't be too feminist, don't be too kinky, don't be too political, don't overdo the violence, don't put in your mother tongue, don't do this. I think everyone who's not in publishing is an expert in how publishing works. And so people will tell you all the things that you need to do to sell your book. And the trick is to just be nice and nod and say, okay. And then as soon as they turn around, you say, fuck it, and you do what you wanted to do, because that's the only way that you're going to write a story that actually moves people. Just say it. Write whatever you want, and if it doesn't work, move on to the next one and try again.
If I could piggyback on that, I think the other thing that's so useful about that is, at least in my experience, anybody here who's in publishing, whatever, is that even those people who tell you what's going to sell, they don't know, right? Like the whole point of publishing is that it is always a guess. And there's how many books they spend $1 million on that book. It is like crowd tested for perfect book club material. Reese is gonna love it, and Oprah's gonna love it, and Jenna's gonna love it. All of them are, and then it just dies. Nothing, and then no one talks about that $1 million they gave that person for nothing. You know what I mean? And then somebody else comes along and they give you $500 and they tell you change everything. And it's just worth remembering they gave so-and-so $1 million and it fucking tanked. It did nothing. So they don't know. But maybe I know. And maybe I know how to find the people who are like me. And then that's the beginning of that. I feel like it's the same thing. It's like that's the beginning of reaching people. It's like they're just on your frequency, and if you get lucky, the frequency gets carried not by Elon's satellites around the world, and people start talking about it. I feel like it's just, at this point in the publishing life, it is wild to me how often I've heard someone say, so-and-so said this is what you got to do to sell a book, to write a book that people will buy, and then later on you say, like, how come nobody bought that book? And be like, we don't talk about that. That's it. It's wild.
Now we really know.
Yes. Now we really know.
I just got the 10-minute warning, so we've got some time for audience Q&As if people want to walk up to the microphone. And while I'm waiting for someone to come up to ask a question, I thought maybe I'd ask you all to pitch the audience on one horror book that you think they should definitely read, not including everyone on the stage, which goes without saying, of course. What's a favorite horror book you think everyone should read?
Well, it's an oldie but a goodie, but We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. I'm sorry, I know this is like cheesy. This is the perfect audience for that much applause. But if you haven't read it, it's amazing and creepy and super short.
I'll do the bouncing off of the classic, Haunting on the Hill, which is the first time that someone's been allowed to go back to Shirley Jackson's universe and write about it, by Elizabeth Hand. It's a haunting on Hill House. It
just came out too, right?
I think so, or it's about to.
Come out,
yes, and it's new, it's modern, it's queer, it's all the good things that contemporary fiction is, at the same place with the same sounds and drafts and ghosts and weird black bunnies, and it's amazing.
I'm gonna say reading any nonfiction book about climate change.
Did you have a question?
Hi. So this is a question that the impetus is for Victor LaValle, but it's an open question. We're in a very literary borough here in Brooklyn, but Queens has had fewer literary icons. We've had like Peter Parker and, Archie Bunker and the Valley of Ashes. So when I started to read your work, I was so moved by how much of my borough you drew in. and how you imbued it with kind of like mystery and wonder and horror. And so I think that's a real gift to, at least to me. And I guess my question is, what does it mean, or how do you think about, or how do you feel when you're doing, taking some place that you know and love or have an ambivalent relationship, but that's close to you, and kind of turn, bring magic or horror or mystery to it? Is that?
Yeah, well, first, thank you very much. I'm going to use this as an excuse also to plug, since we're speaking about locale and all this. At 2 o'clock, I'll be moderating a panel on geography and place with 3 unbelievably talented writers, and I hope you'll come. I believe it's at this same stage. Sorry, that was me deflecting compliments to say that, but it is going to be wonderful. But I wonder this question, maybe the way I would take that question more broadly would be to say, I really appreciate that Queens came through in that way, but I think it was a process to move toward thinking I should write about Queens, if that makes sense. And I wonder for you, just because growing up in Queens, like you say, it was Peter Parker, Archie Bunker, Nas, not that, a couple of amazing writers, but it was not the first place I thought of. So a lot of my stuff took place in Manhattan or Brooklyn or Maine, because I was stealing from Stephen King. And so do you find, was there any hardship, writing about Puerto Rico? Did you ever think I can't write about Puerto Rico? Or was it always no, I'm putting this, I'm putting my foot down here. This is where I'm writing from.
But when I started writing noir, it was more about you have to pick, are you going to do New York noir or LA noir? And I was like, no, screw that, I'm going to do Texas. Because I'm obsessed with psychogeography. Yes. I'm from New York. No one says I'm from New York. You're from Queens. You're from Bronx. You're from Brooklyn. And the way that you're raised and what you experience as a child and as you're coming up, it has an impact on how you see the world. I grew up walking to the beach and jumping in. You don't get to do that in New York. Right. Don't jump in the Gowanus. So it's easy because it's kind of once you decide this is the place, you start thinking about those characters. If they've been there long enough, they have that psychogeography. It's the streets, the buildings, the weather. It all affects how they're going to behave. So I think it just flows once you've decided this is a story that takes place here. And we know that noir can take place in New York or LA, but if you don't live there, you don't have to do that. You can just do something else.
I'd just add that channeling place in some way is a great way to tap into ghostiness and a sense of haunting, because place is inevitably filled with layers of human activity, time, things have happened, and I think when we grab onto that when writing horror, we can access spookiness that way.
And any other audience questions? Yeah, come on.
You got it.
Listening to you, I'm not going to call anybody by name, but listening to you, especially when you were reading your own books, I felt what I'm going to say, loved it, and then you asked a question about genre, suggesting somehow that they knew their genre. He said, I just write the shit that I want to write, and then figure out. As you proceeded to talk about your own work, you sounded so liberated. I would like to liberate you further by suggesting, I would like to write myself, frankly. I've been surrounded by books and people who do it all my life, really. And I'm quite old. I may be the oldest person here. I'm older than I look, actually, although they're trying to prove me wrong. Horror. And I could ask specifically, this is the question. Is there really any such thing as fiction? I believed everything you all were saying, and then he spearheaded it, but you all kind of said in different ways, I write what I like. Which means that something rooted in your own experience is in all of it. Which also means that at some point, you're trying to figure out something thinking you're doing fiction. I'm trying to liberate you. You don't have to think about anything. You said, your wife said, I don't want to see any more women dying. You said, okay, I'll kill everybody but her. That's fiction. I suggested to myself, and I would never have thought of this if I didn't come here today. I'm so glad I'm here, because I would like to write. And everybody who would like to write, even at my age, they figure, what should I write about? At 97, I got plenty to write about. No, I'll tell you something. I'm serious, folks. I've seen, when I was born, Calvin Coolidge was the president. A lot of you don't even know who the hell that is. Of course, I didn't know either. A lot of people did because he didn't do nothing. But, no, I'm serious, though. I'm serious. When you said it, you know what I would have said? With the background of years and so on, I was saying to myself, well, there's no such thing as fiction, obviously. It's all writing something you have lived internally or externally. It's you. It's who you are. And you could be somebody even broader, because you wouldn't turn. When she says, I don't want to see any more women dying, what comes to mind? I've seen a lot. So I know, I was talking when women didn't even sit at the table, much less they were serving. I have actually, when I was younger, been said, what are you doing helping with the dishes, man? What kind of man are you? So it's a lot deeper than just liberation of women and so on. So my solution would have been have the women kill everybody else.
That's the end of the book.
Because that's what I would like to see now. I think that, frankly, since I'm here, I might as well tell you. The first person in public life, of course, Nancy Pelosi won a few things against Trump, like don't come if you're going to close the building, you're not welcome in the House of Representatives, and so on. But the first person who actually called them criminals was Fannie Willis. And she had all these wonderful people walking in and saying, I'm indicting every fucking body, period. They should be in jail. They're crooks. Who is saying that, really? And then she was betrayed by people who let a motorcade come in so he doesn't look like a crook anymore. That's what I think about.
Okay.
The fact that nobody really believes anything. Because when they're writing about, the reporters are just so frustrated. We need writers who will take that bold step and create, it's not fiction, having the women kill I'm kind of kidding, man. Please don't take me seriously. But I really am motivated by the fact that I've been looking a long time, and they talk about how can we deal with these Republican nihilists. How can we? Well, don't deal with them. Just think about the fact that they're all criminals from the time they open their mouth. They come here for that. So when a woman says, I am going to prosecute them as a criminal enterprise, that's so seductive. It's so real. It's so true. And you should not betray her by providing a motorcade. Period. Drag him in and put him in jail and figure out what to do with them like you do the black kids. End of story.
Thank you.
On that note, That's all the time we have.
But let me remind everyone that we'll be signing books to the right? And so yeah, please come on over and
Thank
say
you,
hello.
everybody.
And thank you for coming out.
Thank you.